The gas station clock read 11:47 p.m. when 8-year-old Tommy Martinez walked through the automatic doors, his small frame trembling in clothes 2 sizes too big. His face was streaked with tears he'd tried to wipe away. His sneakers worn thin at the edges, and clutched in his right hand was a crumpled $5 bill, everything he had in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind the counter, a clerk barely looked up from his phone. In the corner booth, 3 truckers nursed coffee and complained about delivery schedules. And at the far end of the store, filling up on energy drinks before a long night ride, stood a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space. Tank Morrison was 6'4" with arms like tree trunks and a gray beard that reached halfway down his chest. The leather vest he wore was decorated with patches that told stories most people couldn't read. But the one that mattered most was emblazoned across his back: Road Wolves MC, President. To most people walking into that gas station, Tank looked like trouble. But to one desperate little boy, he was about to become salvation. If you believe that sometimes the darkest nights produce the brightest lights, that heroes come in unexpected forms, and that justice can still be found in this broken world, then pause right here. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in humanity and show you that sometimes the people society fears most are the ones who protect it when everyone else looks away. Tommy Martinez hadn't always been the kind of kid who wandered gas stations alone at midnight. 6 months ago, he'd been a normal second grader living in a small house on Maple Street with his older sister Sophia and their grandmother, Elena. His biggest worries had been spelling tests and whether he'd get picked for kickball at recess. Sophia was everything to Tommy. At 14, she was his protector, his homework helper, his bedtime story reader, when their grandmother's arthritis made it too painful for her to climb the stairs. Their parents had died in a car accident when Tommy was 3, leaving Elena to raise 2 children on a fixed income that barely covered rent and groceries. Elena Martinez had done her best. At 72, with hands gnarled by decades of factory work and a back bent from years of cleaning office buildings at night, she'd given everything she had to keep her grandchildren safe and loved. She taught them Spanish lullabies, made them beans and rice stretch for 3 days, and promised them that education would be their way to a better life. The house on Maple Street wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, windows that rattled when the wind blew, but it had been filled with love. Sophia had painted stars on Tommy's ceiling with glow-in-the-dark paint she'd saved up for months to buy. Elena had taught him to make her famous empanadas, letting him help roll the dough even when his small hands made more mess than food. Tommy's world had been small but secure. Sophia walked him to school every morning. Elena picked him up every afternoon, and evenings were spent around the kitchen table with homework, stories, and whatever program Elena could find on their old television that wasn't too violent or inappropriate. But everything changed when the Martinez family crossed paths with people who saw their vulnerability as opportunity rather than a reason for compassion. The Hendricks family had lived 3 blocks away in a house that was everything the Martinez home wasn't: large, well-maintained, with a perfectly manicured lawn and 2 expensive cars in the driveway. Rick Hendricks owned 3 auto repair shops around town and served on the city council. His wife, Linda, was president of the PTA and organized the annual charity drive. To everyone in their middle-class neighborhood, the Hendricks were pillars of the community. Rick coached Little League Baseball. Linda volunteered at the food bank. They threw block parties, donated to local causes, and always had the best Halloween decorations. But the Hendricks had a secret that their community standing helped them hide. They were predators who used their respectability as camouflage, their charitable work as cover, and their positions of trust as hunting grounds. Sophia Martinez had caught their attention 6 months ago, when she'd started her first job at Hendricks Auto, sweeping floors and organizing parts after school. At 14, she was eager to help her grandmother with expenses, proud to contribute to their household, and grateful for any opportunity to earn money. Rick Hendricks had been charming at first. He'd praised Sophia's work ethic, given her small bonuses for jobs well done, and told her she was the most responsible teenager he'd ever hired. He'd bought her lunch on busy days, driven her home when the weather was bad, and gradually created a relationship that felt almost paternal to a girl who desperately missed having a father figure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The grooming had been textbook, slowly isolating Sophia from support systems, making her feel special and chosen, creating situations where she felt obligated to him. He convinced her that she was mature for her age, that he understood her better than anyone else, that their relationship was unique and should be kept private. When the abuse began, Rick had made sure Sophia understood the consequences of speaking up. He'd reminded her of her grandmother's age and failing health, of Tommy's dependence on both of them, of how easily he could have her fired and make sure she never got another job in town. He'd shown her the power he wielded through his business connections, his political influence, his standing in the community. Linda Hendricks hadn't been an innocent bystander. She'd been an active participant, helping to manipulate Sophia, creating opportunities for Rick's abuse, and using her position as a respected community member to ensure that any potential allegations would seem unbelievable. The psychological torture had been as devastating as the physical abuse. They convinced Sophia that she was complicit, that she'd somehow invited their attention, that speaking up would destroy her family's already precarious stability. They'd isolated her from friends, made her feel ashamed and dirty, and gradually stripped away every ounce of self-worth she possessed. For months, Sophia had suffered in silence, telling herself she was protecting Tommy and Elena, convincing herself she could endure anything as long as her family remained safe. She'd grown thin and quiet. Her grades had dropped, and the light had slowly faded from her eyes. But Elena and Tommy, trusting and loving, had attributed the changes to teenage moodiness and the stress of balancing school with work. The breaking point had come on a Tuesday evening in late October. Sophia had been working late at the shop, finishing an inventory project that Rick had assigned. The other employees had gone home hours earlier, leaving Sophia alone with Rick and Linda in the back office of the auto shop. What happened that night was worse than anything Sophia had endured before. The Hendricks had drugged her coffee, and when Sophia had tried to resist, to fight back, to finally say no after months of abuse, they'd hurt her in ways that left her hospitalized for 3 days. The official story, the one Rick Hendricks told the hospital staff and police, was that Sophia had fallen from a ladder while trying to reach inventory on a high shelf. An accident, he'd said. A tragic workplace incident. He'd played the role of the concerned employer perfectly, visiting the hospital, offering to pay medical bills, expressing worry about liability and worker safety. Linda had supported every detail of his story, playing the sympathetic mother figure who was devastated that such a sweet girl had been hurt while working for them. They'd brought flowers to Sophia's hospital room, sat with Elena during visiting hours, and convinced everyone around them that they were grieving the accident almost as much as the family. The medical staff had noted injuries inconsistent with a fall, but Sophia, terrified and traumatized, had stuck to the story Rick had told her to tell. When a nurse had gently asked if she felt safe at home, Sophia had nodded. When a social worker had inquired about her relationship with her employers, Sophia had praised their kindness and generosity. Elena, overwhelmed by medical bills she couldn't afford and grateful for the Hendricks' apparent compassion, had never questioned the story. Tommy, too young to understand the adult complexities surrounding his sister's accident, had simply been relieved when Sophia came home from the hospital. But Sophia had come home broken in ways that went far beyond her physical injuries. The girl who had painted stars on Tommy's ceiling, who had helped him with homework every night, who had sung along to the radio while they did dishes together, was gone. In her place was someone quiet and distant, someone who flinched when touched, someone who stared at walls for hours without speaking. Tommy had tried everything he could think of to reach his sister. He'd drawn her pictures at school, saved his dessert from lunch to bring home to her, told her jokes he'd heard on the playground. But Sophia barely responded to anything, lost in a trauma too deep for an 8-year-old to understand. Elena, dealing with her own health issues and working extra hours to pay Sophia's medical bills, had been too overwhelmed to recognize the signs of trauma that were obvious in retrospect. She'd assumed Sophia needed time to heal from her physical injuries, that the depression would lift once she was fully recovered. The Hendricks, meanwhile, had continued their psychological manipulation. They'd sent cards expressing concern about Sophia's recovery. Rick had called regularly to check on her healing progress and to let the family know that Sophia's job would be waiting whenever she felt ready to return to work. The community had rallied around the narrative of a tragic accident and the generous employers who were going above and beyond to support their young employee. The local newspaper had even run a story about the Hendricks' compassion, highlighting their decision to pay Sophia's medical bills and hold her job for her. But Tommy had begun to notice things that the adults around him missed or ignored. He'd seen how Sophia flinched when Rick Hendricks called. He'd watched her face go pale whenever Elena mentioned that the Hendricks had stopped by to check on her. He'd noticed how Sophia had started locking her bedroom door at night, something she'd never done before. Most importantly, Tommy had been awake the night Sophia had the nightmare that changed everything. It was 2:17 a.m. when Sophia's screams had woken him. He crept down the hall to her room and heard her crying and pleading in her sleep, saying no and please stop and don't hurt me over and over again. But what had frozen Tommy's blood was when he'd heard her clearly say Rick Hendricks' name, followed by words that an 8-year-old shouldn't understand but somehow knew were terrible. Tommy had stood outside his sister's door for 20 minutes, listening to her relive trauma in her dreams, understanding for the first time that Sophia's accident hadn't been an accident at all. His 14-year-old sister, the person he loved most in the world, had been hurt by people everyone trusted. And worse, she was too afraid to tell anyone the truth. The next morning, Tommy had tried to talk to Sophia about what he'd heard, but she'd shut down completely, insisting it was just a bad dream, begging him never to mention it to anyone. The fear in her eyes, when she'd made him promise to stay quiet, had been more convincing than any explanation. For weeks, Tommy had carried this terrible knowledge alone. He tried to protect Sophia in small ways, staying close to her when they were out, watching for the Hendricks cars, trying to make her smile with jokes and drawings. But he was 8 years old, powerless against adults, and his sister was disappearing a little more each day. The final straw had come earlier that evening. Elena had received a call from Linda Hendricks, expressing concern that Sophia hadn't returned to work yet, and gently suggesting that perhaps it was time for her to stop dwelling on the accident and get back to normal activities. Linda had offered to pick Sophia up the next morning to ease her back into work gradually, to help her overcome whatever anxiety she might be experiencing. Elena, grateful for such understanding employers and worried about their financial situation, had agreed. She told Sophia that Mrs. Hendricks would be coming to get her in the morning, that it was time to move forward, that work might help her feel more like herself again. Sophia's reaction had been immediate and devastating. She'd collapsed into panic, hyperventilating and begging Elena not to make her go back, pleading to never have to see the Hendricks again. When Elena had pressed for explanations, Sophia had been too terrified to tell the truth, too trained in silence and shame to reveal what had really happened. The argument that followed had broken Tommy's heart. Elena, exhausted and confused, had interpreted Sophia's panic as teenage dramatics. She'd insisted that Sophia needed to be grateful to the Hendricks, that they couldn't afford for her to lose this job, that sometimes we had to do things we didn't want to do. Sophia had run to her room, locked the door, and sobbed for hours. Elena had retreated to her own room, frustrated and worried, but convinced she was doing the right thing by encouraging Sophia to face her fears and return to normal life. That's when Tommy had made his decision. At 8 years old, he'd realized that the adults in his life weren't going to protect his sister. Elena didn't understand the truth, and Sophia was too scared to tell it. Someone had to do something, and if it couldn't be the grown-ups, it would have to be him. Tommy had waited until Elena was asleep, then quietly gathered his $5 allowance, put on his shoes, and slipped out of the house. He had no real plan, just a desperate certainty that he needed to find help somewhere, somehow. Tank Morrison had been riding for 37 years, and in all that time, he'd learned to read people the way most folks read newspapers. The scars on his knuckles told stories of fights he'd won. The patches on his vest marked territories he'd defended. The gray in his beard represented decades of living hard and surviving harder. But when Tank looked at the small boy standing by the candy rack, clutching a $5 bill and trying not to cry, every instinct he'd developed as a road wolf told him that this child was in more danger than any enemy he'd ever faced on the street. Tank had grown up in foster care, bounced between homes where adults saw children as paychecks or punching bags rather than people worthy of protection. He joined the Marines at 17 to escape that system, served 2 tours in Vietnam, and come home to a country that treated veterans like damaged goods. The road wolves had given him the family he'd never had, the brotherhood that had saved his life when civilian society had failed him completely. For 20 years, Tank had served as the club's sergeant-at-arms, handling problems that required decisive action. For the last 10 years, he'd been president, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance between the club's outlaw reputation and their unwritten code of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The road wolves weren't choir boys. They'd had their run-ins with law enforcement, their territorial disputes with other clubs, their involvement in activities that existed in gray areas of legality. But they also had rules that were enforced with absolute seriousness. No drugs around children, no violence against women or kids, and no tolerance for anyone who preyed on the innocent. Tank had been stopping for gas and energy drinks before heading out on a late-night ride to clear his head after a difficult day at the garage he owned. The club had been dealing with tensions from a rival group trying to move into their territory, and Tank had spent hours in meetings trying to find solutions that didn't involve bloodshed. But when he saw Tommy Martinez standing alone in that gas station at nearly midnight, looking lost and terrified, all thoughts of club politics vanished. Tank's paternal instincts, developed through years of mentoring younger club members who'd had nowhere else to turn, kicked in immediately. Tank approached Tommy slowly, his voice gentle despite its natural gravel. "Hey there, little man. You okay? It's pretty late for someone your age to be out alone." Tommy looked up at this massive man with his intimidating appearance and saw something that surprised him: kindness in those weathered eyes, genuine concern in that scarred face. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was instinct, but Tommy recognized something in Tank that he'd never seen in the respectable adults who had failed his sister. "I need help," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "They hurt my sister, and nobody believes her. And she's too scared to tell the truth, and I don't know what to do." Tank knelt down so he was eye level with Tommy, his massive frame folding carefully to make himself less intimidating. "Who hurt your sister, son?" "Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks. They own the car place where Sophia works. Everyone thinks they're good people, but they're not. They hurt her real bad and said it was an accident, but I heard her having nightmares. She said their names and begged them to stop hurting her." Tank's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "What's your name, little man?" "Tommy Martinez. My sister is Sophia, and she's 14, and she used to be happy all the time, but now she just cries and won't eat, and tomorrow they're going to make her go back to work for the people who hurt her." Tank felt something ice-cold settle in his chest. The same feeling he'd gotten in Vietnam, when he'd encountered villages where children had been harmed by people who were supposed to protect them. It was a feeling that had never led him astray, a recognition of evil that transcended social status or community reputation. "Tommy, I need you to tell me everything. Can you do that?" For the next 20 minutes, Tommy poured out the whole story. He told Tank about Sophia's personality change, about the suspicious accident, about the nightmares and the fear, and Elena's plan to send Sophia back to work. He described the Hendricks' reputation in the community, their charitable work, their respectability that made Sophia's truth seem impossible. Tank listened without interrupting, his experienced mind cataloging details, recognizing patterns he'd seen too many times before. Predators who used their status as camouflage. Communities that preferred comfortable lies to disturbing truths. Victims too traumatized and isolated to seek help. When Tommy finished, Tank was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. Wheels? It's Tank. I need you to call a meeting. Emergency session. All available members. We've got a situation involving a kid. Tank paused, looking at Tommy's hopeful face. The kind of situation that requires our immediate attention. Tank turned back to Tommy. Son, I'm going to take you home now, and I'm going to have a conversation with your grandmother. And tomorrow, when those people come for your sister, they're going to find out that Sophia Martinez has protectors now. The kind of protectors who don't care about reputation or politics or what people think is respectable. As they walked toward Tank's massive Harley, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. This stranger, with his scary appearance and intimidating reputation, had listened to him when respectable adults had failed, had believed him when authority figures had dismissed the truth, had promised action when the proper channels had offered only bureaucracy and delay. Tank helped Tommy onto the back of his bike, gave him a spare helmet, and started the engine. As they rode through the empty streets toward Maple Street, Tommy held on tight and finally believed that his sister might be safe. The Road Wolves Clubhouse sat on 5 acres of wooded land outside town, a sprawling complex that included the main meeting hall, living quarters for members who needed them, a fully equipped garage, and a bar that served as the social center of their brotherhood. To outsiders, it looked like what it was the headquarters of an outlaw motorcycle club. But to the 63 men who called it home, it was something more sacred, a place where loyalty mattered more than money, where brotherhood transcended blood, and where a man's word was his bond. Tank's emergency call had gone out at 12:43 a.m., and by 1:30, 47 members had gathered in the main hall. Some had been asleep in their beds, others working late shifts, a few partying at local bars. But when Tank called, they came. That was the code they lived by. When a brother needed backup, everything else waited. The men who assembled that night represented a cross-section of blue-collar America that most people never saw or chose to ignore. There was Miguel Santos, a 45-year-old construction supervisor with 3 daughters who coached their soccer teams. Bobby Chains Walker, a Vietnam veteran who ran a small locksmith business and volunteered at the VA hospital. Danny Morrison, Tank's younger brother, who taught auto mechanics at the community college. There was Marcus Stone Johnson, an ex-cop who'd been forced out of the department for refusing to look the other way when fellow officers bent the rules. Jimmy Kowalski, a paramedic who'd seen too much human suffering to have patience for bureaucracy that protected predators. Ray Gutierrez, a master electrician who'd grown up in foster care and understood what it meant to have nobody in your corner. These weren't Hollywood bikers or weekend warriors playing dress-up. They were men who'd been forged by hard lives, who'd found family in each other when society had written them off, who'd learned that sometimes the only justice available was the kind you created, yourself. Tank stood at the front of the room, Tommy Martinez beside him, looking small but determined. Elena Martinez sat in a folding chair nearby, her weathered hands clasped in her lap, her eyes wide with the shock of having her quiet life suddenly intersected by forces she'd never imagined. The ride to the Martinez house had been tense. Elena had been terrified when Tank had knocked on her door at 1 a.m., this massive biker with her grandson on his motorcycle. But Tommy had vouched for Tank, and something in the older man's respectful demeanor had convinced Elena to listen. Tank had spent an hour in the Martinez living room, listening to Elena's story, observing Sophia through her cracked bedroom door, and gradually understanding the full scope of what they were dealing with. Sophia's terror at the mention of returning to work, her obvious trauma symptoms, the way she flinched when Elena mentioned the Hendricks, it all painted a picture that Tank recognized too well. Elena's shock at learning the truth about her granddaughter's accident had been genuine and heartbreaking. The guilt of not recognizing Sophia's suffering, of nearly sending her back to her abusers, had left the 72-year-old woman devastated. She'd agreed to come to the clubhouse only because Tank had convinced her that the road wolves offered Sophia protection that the legal system couldn't or wouldn't provide. Now, standing before 47 men who'd given up their sleep to respond to an emergency call, Tank told Sophia's story. He spoke with the quiet intensity that his brothers recognized as a signal that this was personal, that this mattered in ways that transcended club politics or territorial disputes. When Tank finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Marcus Stone spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years in law enforcement before his conscience had cost him his badge. I know the Hendricks family. Rick's got connections throughout. The police department, the DA's office, the city council. He's donated to half the politicians in this county. If we try to handle this through official channels, it'll get buried so deep we'll never see justice. Bobby Chain stood up, his Vietnam-era tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. I've seen this before. Respectable predators who use their status to hunt. They count on nobody believing victims, on communities protecting their own reputation over protecting children. Danny Morrison, Tank's brother, added his own perspective. The kid walked into a gas station at midnight, looking for help because every adult in his life had failed his sister. That tells you everything you need to know about how the system's working for this family. The discussion that followed wasn't about whether to act, that had been decided the moment Tank had called the meeting. The debate was about how to respond in a way that protected Sophia while ensuring the road wolves didn't face legal retaliation that could destroy the club. Miguel Santos, whose own daughters were close to Sophia's age, proposed a solution that embodied the club's approach to justice. We make it clear to the Hendricks that Sophia Martinez is under our protection. We let the whole community know that this family has guardians who won't tolerate abuse. We use our reputation for exactly what it's meant for protecting people who can't protect themselves. The plan that emerged was methodical and comprehensive. They would escort Sophia to school each day until the school year ended. They would accompany the family to any legal proceedings if Elena decided to pursue charges. They would make their presence known at community events where the Hendricks appeared. They would investigate the auto shop, looking for evidence that might support Sophia's case. Most importantly, they would confront Rick and Linda Hendricks directly, making it clear that any further contact with Sophia Martinez would be considered a duff from Ireland, direct threat to the Road Wolves MC. They would use their reputation as a shield rather than a sword, leveraging fear of their retaliation to protect a traumatized 14-year-old girl. Tank made assignments with military precision. Miguel would coordinate school escorts. Marcus would handle any police interactions, using his law enforcement background to navigate legal complexities. Bobby would research the Hendricks business dealings, looking for vulnerabilities. Danny would handle media relations if the story went public. But the core mission would involve every available member. At 8 a.m., when Linda Hendricks arrived to pick up Sophia for work, she would find 200 motorcycle engines rumbling in the Martinez neighborhood. She would discover that Sophia Martinez was no longer an isolated victim, but a young woman under the protection of men who'd made protecting the innocent their sacred duty. Elena Martinez sat listening to these dangerous-looking men plan her granddaughter's protection with the kind of methodical care usually reserved for military operations. She thought about the respectable people who'd failed Sophia, who'd dismissed her trauma, who'd been more concerned with maintaining comfortable illusions than confronting ugly truths. Tommy Martinez watched these bikers. These men society told him to fear and saw what real strength looked like. Not the fake authority of people like Rick Hendricks, who used their positions to harm the vulnerable, but the quiet power of men who'd chosen to stand between predators and their prey. As the meeting broke up and members headed home to prepare for the morning's mission, Tank knelt down beside Tommy one more time. You did good tonight, little man. You probably saved your sister's life by having the courage to ask for help. That takes the kind of bravery most grown-ups never find. Tommy looked up at this scarred, intimidating man who'd become his sister's protector and asked the question that had been building in his mind all night. Why are you helping us? You don't even know us. Tank's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. Because somebody should have helped me when I was your age, and nobody did. Because your sister deserves better than what happened to her. Because sometimes the people who look the most dangerous are the ones who will fight the hardest to keep you safe. Linda Hendricks had slept peacefully that Tuesday night, confident in her family's carefully constructed reputation and their ability to manipulate a traumatized teenager back into their control. She laid out her outfit for the morning, a respectable pantsuit that projected maternal authority, the kind of clothing that convinced communities she was a trustworthy advocate for children. At 7:45 a.m., Linda climbed into her pristine SUV and drove toward Maple Street, rehearsing the sympathetic but firm speech she'd give Elena Martinez about the importance of Sophia returning to normal activities. She'd perfected this routine over the years, playing the role of the concerned authority figure who knew what was best for troubled young people. As she turned onto Maple Street, Linda's confidence began to evaporate. The sound reached her first a low, rumbling vibration that seemed to shake the air itself. Then she saw them. Motorcycles lined up along both sides of the street, filling every available parking space, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. 200 bikers stood in formation along the sidewalks, their leather vests displaying patches from clubs across 3 states. Road wolves, iron serpents, thunder hawks, desert riders' brotherhoods that had put aside territorial differences to stand united in protection of one 14-year-old girl. Linda's hands began to shake as she realized the scale of what she was witnessing. This wasn't a coincidence or a rally that happened to conflict with her morning plans. This was a deliberate show of force, a wall of intimidation, specifically designed to send her a message. She pulled over 3 blocks away, her mind racing through possible explanations and escape routes. Her first instinct was to call Rick, to alert him that their carefully maintained secret had somehow been exposed. But as she reached for her phone, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Tank Morrison was walking toward her car, his massive frame moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Behind him came Marcus Stone, Bobby Chains, and Miguel Santos, men whose reputations preceded them, whose presence in any neighborhood meant serious business was being conducted. Linda's hands fumbled with her car's door locks, but Tank was already beside her window, tapping gently on the glass with one scarred knuckle. His expression wasn't angry or threatening, it was something worse. It was calm, professional, the look of someone who'd done this kind of work before and knew exactly how it would end. Linda rolled down her window with trembling fingers, trying to project authority she no longer felt. "What do you want? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just here to help a family in need." Tank's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Mrs. Hendricks, I think there's been a misunderstanding. You see, Sophia Martinez won't be returning to work at your husband's shop. In fact, she won't be having any contact with your family ever again." "I don't understand. Sophia is our employee. She was injured in an accident at our workplace, and we're trying to help her get back to normal activities. What gives you the right to interfere?" Tank's smile was cold as winter steel. "Mrs. Hendricks, we know what really happened to Sophia. We know it wasn't an accident. We know about the months of abuse that led up to that night. And we know that you and your husband have been counting on this community's willingness to look the other way." Linda's face went pale, but she tried to maintain her facade. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Sophia had an accident at work. We've been nothing but supportive. If you're threatening us based on some teenager's fantasies, ma'am," Marcus Stone interrupted, stepping into view beside Tank's massive frame. "I used to be a police officer. I've seen enough abuse cases to recognize the patterns. The isolation, the manipulation, the use of community standing to discredit victims. Your husband fits the profile perfectly. You have no proof of anything. Sophia never made any accusations. You're harassing a respected business owner and his family based on rumors and speculation." Bobby Chain spoke up, his Vietnam veteran's voice carrying an edge that made Linda shrink back in her seat. "Mrs. Hendricks, we're not here to debate evidence or have a legal discussion. We're here to deliver a simple message. Sophia Martinez is under our protection now. Any attempt to contact her, to approach her family, or to retaliate against them in any way will be considered a direct threat to our brotherhood. Linda tried one more time to assert authority, to invoke the respectable facade that had protected her family for years. You can't just threaten law-abiding citizens. I'm going to call the police. My husband will have you all arrested for harassment and intimidation. Tank leaned down so he was eye level with Linda through her car window. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Mrs. Hendricks, you're welcome to call anyone you want. But you should understand something first. We've spent the night making some phone calls of our own. Miguel Santos stepped forward, holding a manila folder thick with documents. Turns out your husband's auto shops have some interesting employment patterns. Young female employees who work alone, who quit suddenly without notice, who develop emotional problems during their time with your company. We found 12 girls over the past 5 years who fit the same pattern as Sophia. 3 of them have already agreed to speak with investigators, Marcus added. Girls who've been carrying this secret for years, waiting for someone to believe them, for someone to give them the courage to speak up. Linda's composure finally cracked completely. The careful mask of respectability fell away, revealing the predator underneath. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Rick has connections throughout this town. He can destroy your little club, have you all arrested, run you out of this county. Tank's laugh was genuinely amused. Mrs. Hendricks, we've been dealing with corrupt authority figures since before you learned how to manipulate vulnerable children. Your husband's connections won't help him when federal investigators start looking into a pattern of child abuse. Because that's what's happening now, Bobby Chains explained. We've contacted the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit. They're very interested in investigating a systematic pattern of abuse involving minors in workplace settings. The reality of her situation finally penetrated Linda's denial. The carefully constructed world she and Rick had built, the reputation that had protected them, the community standing that had made their victims seem unbelievable. All of it was crumbling in the face of 200 men who didn't care about social status or political connections. What do you want? Linda whispered, all pretense abandoned. Tank's answer was simple and non-negotiable. You and your husband are going to close the auto shops and leave this town. You're going to sell your house, liquidate your businesses, and relocate somewhere far from here. You're going to do it quietly, without causing problems for Sophia or her family. And if we don't, then you'll face the consequences of your actions. Marcus Stone replied. Federal investigation, criminal charges, media attention, and 200 bikers who'll make sure this community knows exactly what kind of people you really are. Linda's last desperate attempt at manipulation came in the form of playing the victim. We have rights. We have a life here. You can't just force us to leave everything behind. Tank's response ended the conversation. Mrs. Hendricks, you had rights when you chose to prey on children. Sophia Martinez had rights when you and your husband decided to abuse her. 12 other girls had rights when your family systematically destroyed their innocence. You forfeited your rights when you chose to become predators. Miguel Santos leaned down to the car window. Mrs. Hendricks, as a father of 3 daughters, let me be very clear. You have 72 hours to begin the process of leaving this town. If you're still here after that, if you make any attempt to contact Sophia or retaliate against her family, we'll assume you've chosen the hard way. Linda's SUV pulled away from the curb with squealing tires, her facade of respectability shattered beyond repair. As she drove toward home to deliver impossible news to her husband, 200 motorcycles started their engines in perfect synchronization. The message had been delivered. The neighborhood had witnessed justice being served by men society feared, but children could trust. Sophia Martinez would never again have to face the people who'd hurt her. 3 months later, Riverside High School looked the same as it always had: red brick buildings, chain-link fences, buses dropping off students for another day of classes. But for Sophia Martinez, walking through those familiar hallways felt like navigating a completely different world. The girl who had once flinched at unexpected sounds now walked with straight shoulders. The 14-year-old who had spent months avoiding eye contact now looked people in the face when she spoke. Sophia wasn't completely healed. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight, but she was learning to breathe again, to trust again, to believe that the world contained protectors as well as one of his out predators. Every morning, Miguel Santos waited in the school parking lot, his road wolves vest visible to anyone who might be watching. He didn't speak to Sophia, didn't interfere with her school day, didn't draw attention to himself. He was simply there, a reminder that she was no longer alone, that powerful forces stood between her and anyone who might want to hurt her. The Hendricks family had vanished from town 6 weeks earlier, their departure as sudden and mysterious as Linda's emergency exodus from Maple Street that Tuesday morning. The auto shops had closed overnight, with signs appearing on the doors announcing SOL'd under new management. Their house had gone on the market immediately, selling to the first cash buyer who'd made an offer. Some people in town whispered about the circumstances of their departure, about the morning 200 bikers had appeared in a quiet residential neighborhood, about federal investigators who'd spent days interviewing former employees and reviewing business records. But most preferred not to ask too many questions about why such respectable community members had suddenly decided to relocate. Elena Martinez had struggled with the truth about her granddaughter's suffering, with the guilt of not recognizing Sophia's trauma, with the realization that the people she'd trusted to help had actually been the ones causing harm. But she'd also discovered something unexpected, a community of protectors who didn't judge her for the ways she'd failed, who understood that sometimes good people made mistakes when they trusted the wrong authorities. The road wolves had quietly taken care of details that the Martinez family couldn't handle alone. Miguel had connected Elena with counselors who specialized in trauma recovery. Marcus had helped navigate the legal complexities of filing formal complaints against the Hendricks. Bobby had ensured that medical bills from Sophia's accident were covered by a legal settlement that included strict confidentiality clauses. Most importantly, they'd given Sophia something she'd lost in the months of abuse: the knowledge that there were adults in the world who could be trusted to put her safety above their own comfort, who would fight for her, even when fighting was difficult, who valued her well-being more than maintaining social harmony. Tommy Martinez had grown 3 inches that summer, but the real change in him wasn't physical. The 8-year-old who'd walked into a gas station at midnight, carrying $5, and a desperate hope had learned lessons about courage that most people never master. He discovered that sometimes the most important thing you can do is ask for help, that heroes don't always look like the people in storybooks, that protecting someone you love might require trusting someone society tells you to fear. Tank Morrison still stopped by the Martinez house once a week, usually bringing groceries or offering to help with household repairs that Elena couldn't afford to hire professionals to handle. Sophia had stopped flinching when his motorcycle rumbled into their driveway. Tommy had started asking questions about mechanics and engines, fascinated by the gentle way this intimidating man explained complex machinery. Elena had learned to make enough dinner for 4 people on the nights Tank visited, understanding that food was how she expressed gratitude for protection she could never afford to purchase. The kitchen table conversations had become a routine that gave all of them something they'd been missing: the sense of being part of something larger than themselves, of belonging to a community that valued loyalty over status. Sophia's recovery had included something unexpected: the discovery that other girls in her school had experienced similar trauma, had been carrying similar secrets, had been silenced by similar shame. The courage Sophia had found to speak her truth had inspired others to break their own silence, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond her individual case. A support group had formed, meeting weekly in the basement of a local church, facilitated by a counselor who specialized in adolescent trauma. Girls who'd felt isolated and damaged discovered they weren't alone, that their experiences had been real, that their healing mattered to people beyond their immediate families. Tank had attended one of these meetings, at Sophia's request, to talk about the importance of asking for help when traditional authority figures failed to provide protection. His message had been simple: sometimes the people who look most dangerous are the ones most committed to keeping you safe, and sometimes survival requires trusting your instincts over social expectations. The road wolves' reputation in the community had undergone its own transformation. Parents who'd once crossed the street to avoid them now nodded respectfully when they encountered club members at grocery stores or gas stations. Children, who'd been taught to fear men in leather vests, now understood that those same men had risked everything to protect a 14-year-old girl they'd never met. Local law enforcement had developed a grudging respect for the club's approach to community justice. Marcus Stone's connections in the police department had helped bridge gaps between the bikers and authorities, creating channels for cooperation when traditional law enforcement proved inadequate for protecting vulnerable populations. The elementary school, where Tommy attended, had invited Tank to speak at a safety assembly, where he'd taught children about the difference between dangerous strangers and protective strangers, about trusting their instincts when adults in positions of authority made them uncomfortable, about the importance of telling trusted adults when someone made them feel unsafe. Sophia's grades had improved dramatically once the fear had been removed from her daily life. She joined the school's peer counseling program, using her experience to help other students navigate difficult situations. She'd started tutoring younger students in math, rediscovering the joy of helping others that had been stolen from her during the months of abuse. On a warm evening in late August, the Martinez family attended their first Road Wolves community barbecue, an annual event where the club opened their clubhouse to families and neighbors. Sophia had been nervous about attending, worried about being around so many intimidating-looking men in an environment that might trigger memories of vulnerability. But as she watched these bikers playing games with their children, grilling hamburgers for elderly neighbors, organizing activities for teenagers who had nowhere else to go, Sophia understood something profound about the nature of real strength. These men had chosen to use their power to protect rather than exploit, to build community rather than destroy it, to stand with victims rather than enable predators. Elena Martinez stood beside the barbecue pit, watching her grandson play catch with men whose appearance had once terrified her, watching her granddaughter laugh with teenagers whose confidence inspired her own healing. She thought about the respectable people who'd failed her family, who'd prioritized maintaining comfortable illusions over confronting uncomfortable truths. Then she looked at Tank Morrison, this scarred and weathered man who'd risked his freedom to protect children he'd never met, who'd used his reputation as a weapon against predators rather than innocents, who taught her that sometimes the most dangerous-looking people were the safest to trust. "Thank you," Elena said, simply, words that carried the weight of a grandmother's gratitude for the salvation of her family. Tank's response embodied everything the Road Wolves stood for. "Mrs. Martinez, family protects family. Sophia and Tommy are family now. That's not something that changes." As the evening wound down and families began to head home, Sophia Martinez stood in the clubhouse doorway, looking at the patches and photographs that decorated the walls. Pictures of brotherhood rides, community service projects, memorial services for fallen members. Images that told the story of men who'd found family in each other, who'd chosen loyalty over conformity, who decided that protecting innocence was worth any risk. Tommy Martinez ran up to his sister, excited to tell her about the motorcycle safety course. Tank had promised to teach him when he got older about the mechanical skills Miguel had offered to share, about the sense of belonging he'd found among men who valued courage over compliance. Sophia hugged her little brother, remembering the night he'd walked into a gas station at midnight carrying $5 and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would help them. She thought about the chain of events that had led from that moment of crisis to this evening of community, from isolation and terror to protection and healing. "Sophia," Tommy asked, "do you think things would have been different if I'd asked different people for help that night?" Sophia looked around the clubhouse, at the men who'd dropped everything to respond to an 8-year-old's plea for help, who'd risked their reputations and their freedom to confront predators that the respectable community had protected. "No, Tommy," she answered with certainty. "You found exactly the right people. You found the ones who cared more about protecting kids than protecting their own comfort. You found real heroes. As the Martinez family walked toward Tank's truck for a ride home, Sophia Martinez carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd learned that she deserved protection, that her voice mattered, that there were adults in the world who could be trusted to put her safety above everything else. Tommy Martinez walked beside his sister, knowing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is ask for help, that heroes don't always look like the people in movies, that protecting someone you love might require trusting someone society tells you to fear. Elena Martinez followed her grandchildren, grateful for the lesson that respectability and goodness weren't the same thing, that sometimes the people who look most dangerous are the ones most committed to keeping you safe. And behind them, Tank Morrison watched his extended family head home, satisfied that another predator had been stopped, another victim had been protected, another community had learned that justice comes in many forms. Sometimes wearing badges and carrying legal documents, sometimes wearing leather and riding Harleys. 6 months after Tommy Martinez walked into a gas station at midnight, carrying $5 and desperate hope, Sophia Martinez stood at her high school graduation, valedictorian of her class, heading to college on a full scholarship. In the audience, 200 bikers who'd become her extended family cheered louder than anyone. Elena Martinez sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by the Road Wolves members who'd become the family she'd never expected to find. Beside her, Tank Morrison wore his dress uniform, not the leather vest, but his Marine Corps dress blues, because Sophia had asked him to represent the military family she'd never known. Tommy Martinez, now 9 years old and wise beyond his years, had learned to ride dirt bikes under Tank's careful instruction. He discovered that real strength meant protecting people weaker than yourself, that courage sometimes looked like walking into a gas station at midnight, asking strangers for help, that heroes came in all forms. The story of Sophia Martinez had spread beyond their small town, inspiring other victims to speak up, encouraging other communities to question the difference between respectability and goodness, proving that sometimes the people society fears most are the ones who will fight hardest to protect innocence. If this story restored your faith that good people still exist, that heroes come in unexpected forms, that justice can still be found in dark places, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about a time someone unexpected stood up for you or someone you love. Subscribe to this channel, because we find and tell these stories every week, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about communities coming together to protect the vulnerable, about the truth that real strength means using your power to lift others up rather than tear them down. Remember, the next time you see someone who looks dangerous, who carries scars, who doesn't fit society's definition of respectable, they might be exactly the person you need when everything else fails. They might be the heroes who show up when all the proper channels have closed, when all the authorities have looked away, when all the respectable people have chosen comfort over courage. Sometimes the angels we pray for ride motorcycles. Sometimes they wear leather instead of halos. Sometimes they have criminal records instead of clean reputations. But they answer when children cry for help in the darkness, and they never stop fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. Because brotherhood isn't about blood or background, or what society thinks is acceptable. Brotherhood is about showing up when someone needs you, standing between predators and prey, and proving that family means protecting each other no matter what the cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.